The class today is titled Life by Design. And you will notice that I will rarely use the word retirement because in my view, it's a bad word. It describes something that, I mean, it conjures up ideas that we really want to get away from. There is retirement in life, to be sure, but not yet. This term retirement winds up being applied to all of those years that happen kind of essentially after you stop working. And I think that really misses the big point about the opportunity that's available to people. There is no term for this phase of life that we're going to be describing. I simply call it the next phase of life. There are other terms that different authors and writers have used to describe this next phase, but none of them have stuck. And the default is people talk about retirement. I will try to avoid using that word, quite honestly. And the reason is that the retirement that people in my generation are facing, and frankly, I think all future generations are facing, is very different than the description of the next phase of life that we were given by our parents, by our guidance counselors in high school. It is simply, my retirement is so dramatically different from my parents' retirement. We're just not even talking about the same game. I mean, I'm 72. I'm just booking a trip right now down to Guatemala where I can hike 50 miles into the jungle to see a Mayan ruin called El Mirador. I'm sure when I go on that trip, there's going to be other old goats just like me. My dad at 72 would no more have thought about something like that than flying to the moon. It's simply a different game. The problem is most of us were raised with the idea of traditional retirement, and I think that's a mistake. And that's what we're really trying to overcome now. The next phase of life, I think, focuses on three fundamental issues. Finances and health are two issues that we all think about, and appropriately so. I think, interestingly, my parents only thought about finances because they didn't think there was much that could be done about their health. And to some extent, well, by the time my parents died, the medical profession had made great advances. But my parents' generation didn't spend a lot of time thinking about managing their health so they could live longer and more healthy, active lives. Because frankly, the technology wasn't there. Doctors fix broken bones. Frankly, if I had been born in my parents' generation, I'd probably be in a wheelchair right now. Because of, I mean, the technology that fixed my back wasn't available 50 years ago. In any event, finances, health, these are common things that people think about. There's plenty of resources out there, Xena and many others in the financial management universe, doctors and other healthcare institutions. So those two things are not what I worry about. That's not what this program is principally about. Finances and health kind of working on the periphery, but primarily what we're talking about here is the idea of what are you going to do essentially with 20 or 30 years of Saturdays? What do you do when you wake up in the morning? What's the activity that's going to take care of your life? What are you going to do in this time frame? That to me has always been, interestingly, a far more important question than the money and the health. Yeah, I think about the money. Yeah, I think about the health. But I was always, 20, 25 years ago, I was more concerned about what I was going to do when I got up in the morning. And that really is what led me down this path that I began exploring probably 25 years ago. I'm going to start off with kind of how this view of retirement has essentially changed. And it's what I will call the evolution of a new third box of life. Many of you are probably familiar with a guy by the name of Richard Bowles. He wrote a book that most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, and that's called What Color is Your Parachute? About career transition. Well, back in the early 90s or the late 80s, I'm not sure exactly when, Richard Bowles wrote another book called The Three Boxes of Life. And in that book, he described that there are essentially three phases to life. There is the development phase, which might be termed the youth phase or the education phase. Then you have the productivity phase, which is essentially the adult phase of life. That's the fat part of life. You go to work, you have a career, you get married, you have a family, you buy a house, you save for retirement. That's the fat part of life. The development, the education phase goes on for, at least when I was reading this book or when I was growing up, it's kind of like a, till you get out of college type of thing or get out of high school. And then your development phase ends and you move up into the adult phase and spend the rest of your adult life really trying to make it all work. And then it ends with the retirement box, the old age box. As a historian, I looked at this, read this book by Bowles, and I thought it made a great deal of sense. I think this describes how pretty much human existence has operated throughout all of human society. There is this youth box, there is the adult box, and there's a retirement box. The thing is, back when we were cavemen banging around in, in southern France or whatever, the development box lasted until you were old enough to pick up sticks and bring them to the fire. You didn't have much of an education phase. The productivity phase was pretty much where everything was. As an adult, and you became an adult very early in that kind of an environment, you had to contribute to the society. And in that universe, the idea of retirement, frankly, didn't exist very much. And the simple reason was society had not reached a point where they could support people in their old age without those people actually contributing to the productivity of the society. And pretty much the same was true in this development phase, the education phase with youth. Kids had to get into the productive workforce very early. And that's just the way it has been for a million years. It changed as a result of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution allowed human society to produce a lot more stuff, a lot more food, a lot more clothes, a lot more machinery, housing, everything. It also placed a greater need on education in the way that we think of it today. One of the consequences of that increased productivity is that by the time people got old enough, many were able to have set aside enough resources so they could actually enter into something that we would call retirement. That is, they stop working and essentially they go on vacation for the last few years of their life. It's kind of the rest and retirement kind of version of retirement. That's a product of the Industrial Revolution. And that's the model that all of us were handed as kids growing up. It leads to a life that sort of looks like this. This is the traditional retirement model that we were given as kids. You break out of that youth box, the education box, the development, and you move into the productivity box, and you go to work, and you work for 40 or 50 years. You run around for, decades with your hair on fire, and every once in a while you come home on evenings and weekends and do your R&R thing. You play with the kids, you cut the grass, maybe you go on vacation for a couple of weeks, and then you get to the point where you can retire in that traditional sense. You stop working, and all day, every day is essentially vacation. This is the model that we were handed as kids. It's the model that was invented as a result of the Industrial Revolution, essentially, and it was institutionalized in the 1920s, 1930s, maybe a little earlier than that, depending on where you live. In the United States, the formal institutionalization of this process would be the passage of the Social Security Act in 1935, which basically standardized retirement at age 65. And so people essentially fell off the cliff at age 65. They went on to an R&R kind of retirement, rest and relaxation, and then they died, which typically didn't happen too long after that. When Franklin Roosevelt pushed through the Social Security Act, the life expectancy in the United States was 62. The retirement age was 65. Wasn't a big deal. Most people never got there. For my dad's generation, the life expectancy was 72. My dad died at 72. Franklin Roosevelt died at 63. Roosevelt never had retirement. That generation statistically never got to retirement. And my dad's generation got to retirement. They spent a few years there. The last year or two, they were sick, and then they died. There you go. This is the model that we were handed. I don't think this was ever a good model, but to a certain extent, it worked okay because A, people didn't live that long and never got to retirement, or if they got there, they weren't around for very much longer after that, so it didn't much matter. But we live in a new world, and things have changed pretty dramatically. We live longer lives. If I could get Zena up here and ask her what the life expectancy is she typically plans for her clients in financial planning, it's probably 90 or 95.
Yep.
Right?
90 is, unless they tell us otherwise.
Yep. Which is what you need to do. My dad had to plan essentially for a 7-year retirement. I have to plan for a 25 or 30-year retirement. It is an entirely different problem. And as we talked earlier, the healthcare industry, medical profession has advanced huge strides in the last 40, 50 years. I mean, as I mentioned, I'd probably be in a wheelchair if I was born in 1930 because they wouldn't have been able to fix my back. One of these days, not too far down the future, I'm going to have a knee replacement. But they'll do it, and then I'll be fine. There's all kinds of wonderful things that happen. So we not only live longer, we're actually living longer in a much more healthy way. The second thing I think is important to recognize here is that we have an entirely different set of expectations out of life than prior generations. My guess is that most of the people on this call are like me, boomers. We were born essentially after World War II. When I write the great American novel, it will be based on the idea that the post-World War II generation in America is the first generation to be born fundamentally secure. That is, we never worried about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. We just took it for granted we were going to be fine. My great-grandparents died of the Spanish influenza in 1919. My great-grandmother, my great-grandfather died within 3 days of one another. Both of my grandparents were virtually unemployed. My grandfathers were unemployed in the 1930s for about 5 years. It was almost 10 years before my dad's dad was able to resume his career as a bricklayer. They were poor. My grandmother actually wrote a note to Franklin Roosevelt trying to keep her home. It was an entirely different world. And then my dad goes off to World War II. What the hell have we faced? We talk about all these great trials that Americans have faced. Are you kidding me? Think of our life since World War II. The point is that the idea of security, my dad, my mom, they were worried about paying the rent, having enough food. After that, that's about it. Okay. Anything after that was pretty much gravy. My dad gets to retirement and he thinks he slid into home safe. He won the game. He got to retirement. Now that was a pretty big deal because his dad never got there and his father-in-law never got there. They died in the harness. Okay. My dad got to retirement and anything after that was flat out gravy. I get to retirement and I'm worried about booking trips to go hike into northern Guatemala and learning how to scuba dive and learning how to draw and all kinds of things that I have for expectations of my life. Our parents just didn't have those. And then finally, you get to the question of financial security. Well, I wouldn't make the case that everybody has enough money saved up. What I would do is say that even if you don't have enough money saved up, society is much richer and provides resources for people a lot better than we ever did before. And in fact, the cost of living, the relative cost of living is much cheaper today than it was when we were kids. There are resources available to people. I mean, I'm on the OPC call. Well, do you think the OPC existed 50 years ago? Wasn't there, okay? My grandmother got on a plane to go back to England for the first time since she left in 1922, since she was last there. She got on a plane in like 1960. My guess is it cost her about $400 to do that. When I go over to Europe today, it costs me maybe $1,000. The cost of living is very, very different. The ability to operate and live in the next phase of life is much cheaper relatively than it's ever been. The point is that while people may get into the next phase of life and they really don't have everything they need financially, it is almost certainly true they have most of it. First of all, you get into retirement and you don't need to spend as much money. Secondly, there are going to be things like Social Security, pensions, savings, even if those savings aren't enough, equity in the house, those types of things that will cover most of what their financial requirements are, especially when you consider that in the next phase of life, you don't need to spend as much money. The point is that while some people move into the next phase of life, they still need to earn an income. They don't need to earn the same income that they did when they were working full time. All of this leads to an entirely different look at what life is going to be. There's still the development phase. Now, for us nowadays, that development, that education, that youth phase probably is running for most people into the mid-20s. I mean, how many kids still live with their parents after they graduated from college, right? Then you have the productive phase that's still there. It's still the fat part of life. It's still kind of what you're striving for in that development phase, is to figure out what you're going to do in that productive phase. You have a career, you generate income, you have a house, you have kids, you have a wife or a husband. All of those things are still occurring in the productive phase. But the retirement phase, the old age phase, has essentially been pushed out. And instead of moving into the retirement phase after the productivity phase, I think we are moving into a new box of life that, for lack of anything else, we'll simply call the fulfillment box. That's the phase of life that I'm living in now. That's the phase of life that most of you on this call are living in now. It's really not the retirement phase. This is kind of my view of this new third box. Again, you work, you get to a point where you step out of the game. But do you step out of the game completely? Well, not necessarily. It doesn't mean you continue working, generating income. It does mean that you have some form of committed activity that is essentially an obligation for you to do when you get up in the morning. You've got a purpose to get up in the morning. Now, that said, you have carved out more time for the R&R stuff. It just isn't all R&R. There's this balance between kind of R&R and committed activity. Now, eventually, I think all of us or most of us will get to a point where the committed activity goes away entirely, and we do flip over to something that we might properly call retirement, which is pure R&R stuff. You know, I'm 72. I expect to be doing pretty much what I'm doing now for another 10, 15 years. Let's hope anyhow. That's my dream. In my view, the next phase of life is driven by three basic phrases: balance. Balance between the R&R stuff and committed activity. Multifaceted, that is variety. Life is filled with all kinds of possibilities. When we were in the productivity phase of life, we didn't have time to take advantage of all the multifaceted aspects of human existence, of the world, of life. Now we have that time. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody wants to be involved in a whole bunch of different things, but many of us do. And the point is that now you have the opportunity to be involved in a variety of things, not simply you got to go to work and you got to come home and cut the grass and raise the kids. There's time, there's opportunity. And then finally, it's autonomy. Nobody's telling you what to do. You know, 20 years ago, you had to do what your boss said. You had to do what the mortgage company said. You pretty much had to do what your kids said. You had to do what your spouse said, because your spouse was all concerned about the money and everything else. Now you move into the next phase of life. Nobody tells me what to do. I can do pretty much anything I want, so long as I take care of she who must be obeyed. I'm fine. And that's the way it is for most of us. We have this incredible luxury of freedom to do whatever it is that we pretty much want. Balance, variety, and autonomy. So the new third box, this image here, you've got the R&R side, you've got the committed activity side. In the interest of space, I kind of threw this slide in. These are the kinds of things that it might look like. In the R&R side, you might be learning how to speak French. You might travel a lot. You might be interested in studying genealogy. On the committed activity side, you may continue working, not full-time, but as a consultant, maybe a couple of days a week, or maybe you pick up a part-time job, doing what you used to do. Or maybe you do something completely different. You might volunteer in things like food banks or in hospitals or at child development centers or substance abuse areas or whatever. You might teach it. The point is that your life could be all of these things. This is not terribly different from what my life looks like today. Some of it's the R&R stuff, some of it's the committed activity stuff. The R&R stuff is essentially you personally enjoying life. It's life as a vacation. The committed activity is when you get up in the morning, you've got an obligation to do something for somebody outside of the home, or at least somebody outside of you. It could be taking care of your mother. The thing is, this is a choice. The last time you had the kind of choices you have now, that is when you move into the next phase of life, the last time you had this kind of flexibility, you were 21, young, stupid, and broke. None of those things are true now. You have a lifetime's worth of experience, you have resources that are available to you, and nobody's telling you what to do. This is the time, I think, the best time you will ever have in your life to design what it is you want your life to look like. I think shame on us if we don't take advantage of it. Now, this all starts, in my view, with creating a vision of what it is that you would really want your life to look like. Without that vision, without having goals, objectives in mind, I think what winds up is you simply drift along from one day to the next. You need a plan. Every day of your life, but particularly at points like this, major events in your life, you get married, you get divorced, you get a new job, you lose a job, your kids move out of the house, you retire. At major events like that, this chart starts to become especially important, but the fact is it's true every day of your life. You have essentially three choices of what you're going to do tomorrow. The first choice is what I would call inertia. Essentially, you do tomorrow what you did today because that's what you did yesterday. One of the things that I've done for the last 20 years is worked extensively with people who have lost a job and they're going out to market to find another job. And 95% or higher, when they get started in this search, invariably they want to go get a job that's very similar to the one they just left. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Of course, we're not talking about a job for you right now. We're talking about the next phase of life, and it's going to include the R&R kinds of things. But here's the point. What I see happening with clients, and we're talking a few thousand by this time, what their vision is for the future is they're continue to do 7 days a week for the next 20 or 25 years, what they have been doing on weekends for the last 30 years. If they golf, oh yeah, when I retire, it's going to be great. I'm going to go golfing more. Really? How many times a day? How many days a week? How many weeks a year? When I retire, we're going to go up to the cottage. Great. And do what? Okay. The inertia thing may be fine, and there's inertia for all of us. There's things that we have done in the past that we will continue doing, and that makes perfect sense. But the question is it something that's going to be meaningfully occupying your time for the next 20 or 30 years? The first option is inertia. You keep doing whatever it is that you have been doing. Nothing wrong with it. There's going to be plenty of inertia in your life, but it's option one. Option two is what I would call the dumb luck option. You change direction. You move in a different direction than you have been doing. You do something different. but it happens accidentally. Your next door neighbor volunteers at the food bank, and one day over the backyard fence, they say, gee, why don't you come and help me volunteer at the food bank? So you go. Not because you ever thought about doing that, but because your neighbor invited you. And you go and you get heavily involved in the food bank, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. That's great. But let's think about what it really is. It's simply a random occurrence. You had no choice in making that happen other than you grabbed for the brass ring when it came around on the carousel. You didn't do anything to put the brass ring there. It just happened. It was completely accidental. There's nothing wrong with that. There's going to be plenty of that in life. And then you have the third option. Option 3 is essentially you move in a different direction, but instead of moving in a different direction as a result of dumb luck, you move in a different direction as a consequence of a conscious choice. You make a decision to move in a new direction. I think everybody on this call is thinking about that. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be here. But the idea is that as you move into the next phase of life, maybe there's more than inertia. And maybe I should do more than wait around for the dumb luck stuff to happen. Maybe I should take myself down some paths that I've never done before. Now, again, I think that's why you're on this call. The problem with this is that, well, it's not a problem. It's just that in order to do this appropriately, if you think in terms of short term, the chances are all you're going to do is bang around in the world that is already familiar with you. You know, if I ask, gee, what do you want to be doing in 6 months? I think that your imagination is going to be very limited. You will basically only come up with stuff that you've already thought about, that you've already done. There's nothing wrong with that, but it is by nature limiting. And so if you want to make choices, if you want to make conscious decisions of moving your life in some new directions that will be more rewarding for you, the first thing I think you need to do is to push the bar out 10 years. Xenia, come back online.
I'm here.
Okay, we're going to use you as a guinea pig.
Uh-oh.
You like music?
Yes.
How would you like to be the piano man banging out tunes at the local saloon? Wouldn't that be cool?
That would be fun.
Yeah. Can you get that job tomorrow?
Sorry?
Can you go get that job tomorrow?
Yeah.
Why not?
Don't have enough practice playing piano.
There you go. And that's the point. If you were trying to do that in 6 months, you not only couldn't you do it, you would never even think about doing it. It doesn't make the discussion list because you're focusing short term. I know I can't be the piano man in 6 months, so I'm not even going to think about it. On the other hand, come back online, Zena.
I'm here.
If I said you could be anywhere you want in 10 years, could you be the piano man banging out tunes at the local saloon? I'm not talking about Carnegie Hall. That's a whole different level of skill. But banging out tunes at the, the Rochester Brewery or whatever, could you get there in 10 years if that's what you wanted to do?
Yes.
Yes, it's exactly the point. It's believable. Quite honestly, everybody on this call can be pretty much anywhere they want to be in 10 years. Now, none of us are going to be a quarterback for the Detroit Lions. We're not going to be a relief pitcher for the Tigers in 10 years. So you got to be slightly realistic here. But the fact is, you could be banging out tunes at the local saloon in 10 years. That's the goal. If that's the goal, what do you do tomorrow?
Look up how to take lessons. Look up where.
There you go. You've got the goal of being the piano man 10 years from now. Now you come back to what can you do now? And what you can do now is start taking piano lessons. I'm not saying you're going to get there in 10 years. What I am saying is unless you start taking the piano lessons, you sure as heck won't get there. Right? But why do you take the lessons? Because you have the vision of what it is that you want to be doing 10 years from now. And that's the key thing here. You have to have the vision of what it is that you want. You can't get there in the short term. If we simply did this based on, gee, what can you do next month? That's not much in the way of life planning. You got to think much longer term. What do you really want out of this? And if music and the piano and the excitement of being the piano man at the local saloon really geeks you up, you can get there. You absolutely can get there. Go start taking the lessons. Buy a piano, get a keyboard, something. So this is very fundamental. Inertia is there. It's going to happen most of the time for most of us. Dumb luck comes into play every once in a while. There's nothing wrong with either of these things, but this, whatever you call it, class or discussion or whatever, is not about those things. It's about having a vision of what it is that you want your life to look like down the road, 10 years, so that you have goals that will allow you to come back now and start taking steps to move in that direction. I don't know, maybe 30 years ago, I came up with the notion that there are two kinds of people in life. There are dots and there are lines. And here's the idea. As a human being, we all have a certain reach. That reach, that radius, is essentially dictated by our intellect, by our knowledge, by our personality, by where we exist, who our friends are, who our acquaintances are, all of that kind of stuff. But we have a reach that is within us. It's our reach. If you stay in one place, that reach will bring you into contact with pretty much the same stuff all the time. Now, it's certainly true that you can learn a little bit more, you can make some new friends, lightning can come striking through your circle, and your circle might get a little bit bigger, it might be a little bit more interesting, but essentially, your radius defines your reach. And if you stay in the same spot, that reach is going to bring you into contact with the same stuff all the time. A line, on the other hand, now you guys can go back to your 10th grade geometry class. A line, on the other hand, is a series of dots. And as you move down that line, that radius moves with you. So as you move down the line, you're coming into contact with more and more things. The movement down the line brings you in contact with new stuff, new ideas, new people, new whatever, even though your radius has stayed the same. Okay, does that make sense? So what's the difference between a dot and a line? Goals. If you don't have goals, if you don't have a vision for what it is that you want, why would this dot move? Even if you wanted to move, if you sitting there today and you think, gee, that makes a lot of sense. I'm a dot, but this makes a lot of sense. Well, unless the dot starts moving down a line, nothing's going to change. And the only way for you to start moving down a line is for you to have goals or visions of what it is that you want your life to look like. Those goals and visions will not only incent action, they also tell you the direction to head. When you go talk to your 19-year-old kids, the 19-year-old kids wind up being frozen in place here because they can't make up their mind on which goals they want to pursue. There's 10. They can't settle on any. And so what do? They stay still. They don't move. That's deadly. The idea is establish the goals and vision. But here's the other thing. You'll never get there. It won't happen. Because what's going to happen as you move down that line, you start coming into contact with new stuff. And as a consequence of that new stuff, you create a new set of goals, new visions, and you start moving down another path. My daughter came to me between her sophomore and junior year in college. And she said, gee, Dad, let's see, yeah, I'm going to go out to Colorado. And I'm going to stay out there for the next year, get residency in Colorado. I want to live an outdoor, active life. I want to work with special needs kids. I'll go out there, I'll get my residency, I'll be able to restart school out in Colorado, and I'll graduate. And this is the direction, the goal, the vision I have for my life. You know where Katie lives now? Switzerland. She's been there for 15 years. She lives in a little ski resort, the valley of a very prominent ski resort. She works in an international school, working with special needs kids. In fact, what she's done is she started her own company in Switzerland as essentially a tutor, working with special needs kids. It all started from, her vision has changed many times, but it all started, but she always has a vision. And it's the idea of pursuing that vision. Will you ever get there? Probably not. But here's the thing that you want to take away from this, and you've all heard this. Life isn't about the destination, it's about the journey. I can tell you where we're all going to end up. The only issue is, what are you going to do on your way there? You can stay here, you can be a dot, or you can start establishing goals and visions for yourself to move forward. So, the dot and the line. The trick is, of course, developing that vision. That is the problem. That's the real work of this whole process. Up until this point, it's kind of nice philosophical stuff. But here's where we start to get into the real nitty-gritty here. Let me start with this premise, that all of life is about performing some kind of task in some kind of environment. You do something and you do it in some kind of an environment. You may be washing dishes in your kitchen, or you may be washing dishes in a 2-star Michelin hotel in Paris. Your life is very different depending on the task and the environment, okay? But all of life is about doing something and doing it in some kind of environment. You right now are listening to this particular class. The environment you're doing it in is online. This would be a different experience if we were doing it face-to-face in the OPC building. Okay, it's a different environment. You could be reading a book and still kind of performing the same sort of task. All of life is about performing tasks in some kind of environment. As you move into the next phase of life, it seems to me that your objective ought to be performing tasks that you find rewarding in environments that you find rewarding or enjoyable. And if that's not what your goal is, you might as well get off the call now, because that's what this is all about. What is it that you really want your life to look like? What kinds of environments do you want to be doing that in? So this gets us now to the Lego block theory of life. Whenever you perform it, we'll stick with tasks here because that's the easiest. Whenever you perform a task, let's say, for example, give a talk to people on how to plan for the next phase of life. In order for me to perform this task, I use a great combination of particular skills, knowledges, personal traits, interests, and values. I take that combination of skills, knowledges, and traits, put them together to perform the task that I am currently performing. You could have gotten somebody else to give this talk. They may have very well built the end result may have been something very similar to what we're going to talk about here today, or have been talking about here today. But they would have used different skills, knowledges, traits, interests, and values to get there. Maybe some of them would have overlapped, some of them would have been different. The end result, the task that we're performing, teaching people how to think about the next phase of life, that could be done by lots of different people. The point is that I do it using the skills, knowledges, traits, interests, and values that I have that are important to me. And here's the thing. I enjoy doing this not because of the task I'm performing, but because I'm scratching itches that are important to me. These skills, knowledges, traits, interests, and values, when I perform a task that I enjoy, it's not because I enjoy the task. It's because I'm utilizing the assets that are important to me. Simply put, and this actually is kind of a self-revelation that occurred for me as I went through this process 15 years ago, 20 years ago. I like getting in front of people. In my next life, I may need to come back as an actor. I like getting in front of people, which is why doing this online drives me crazy. I'd far rather be doing this in front of you. But the point is, that is one of the traits that I have, that's a thing about me. I also have values and interests and knowledges and skills that are associated with doing what I'm doing today. And so long as I'm able to use those assets that are important to me, I will be happy doing whatever it is. The task doesn't matter. The trick is using the skills, knowledges, and traits and interests and values that are important to you. So what happens here is the essential process, and I sent you this slide that hopefully you all got it. Good. You'll want to refer to this. The first step in the process is to figure out what's important to you, what those assets are that are important to you. Skills, knowledges, traits, values, and interests. If you read anybody who writes about this subject, they will talk about identifying what these assets are, but they won't call them assets. They will call them something different. Drivers, motivators. The catchy little term that I use is, what are the itches for you? What are the itches you have? Figure out what those itches are. Figure out what those drivers, those motivators, those assets are that you have that are particularly important to you. Then prioritize them. Which are most important? And at that point, you start essentially a brainstorming process to imagine how you might scratch those issues. What kinds of tasks, in effect, might you be performing that would allow you to scratch those itches? What kind of environment would you want to be in that would allow you to scratch those itches? So for me, for example, and one of the things that I suggest is creating a Venn diagram like this, so you can overlap some of these assets. But for me, for example, teaching is something that I've done all my life. History is the great passion for me. Travel. So if we take developing a vision for what craft's life should look like, and literally, this is absolutely true, I need to be teaching, I need to be involved in history, and I need to be traveling. Now, there's a whole bunch of other things, but those are three things that come to the top of the list pretty quickly. One of the things that I started thinking about 10 years ago was working as a tour guide in Normandy, giving battlefield tours of Omaha Beach, Utah, and the Battle of Normandy. Scratches all those itches. And I pursued that. I was just thinking the other day, I've got to send another note to this guy. And the excuse will be, gee, COVID sucks. Do you need any tour guides? You know, essentially what the message will be. Because I haven't been able to pull that one off yet. But last week, I gave a presentation online, a Zoom presentation for somebody, some library. No, it was the Greater West Bloomfield Historical Society on the Battle of Normandy. And it was, you know, an hour and a half presentation. They pay me for it. And I'm scratching all of those itches. I'm teaching. The travel is important because I've been back to Normandy 5 times in the last 10 years to see that and walk through that whole area. And of course, history. I'm scratching those itches. You can scratch the itches in lots of different ways. The point is, figure out what the itches are, then really push the bar out 10 years, dream. What is it that you really would like to be doing that would allow you to scratch those itches? One of my clients called this the great bodacious ideas. This is, some of the stuff might be pretty far-fetched. Quite honestly, spending 3 months in Normandy every year for 10 years or 5 years, or whatever I was talking about, was a little bit of a stretch. I'm not sure she who must be obeyed would have gotten too much pleasure out of that, because she doesn't like to travel. But the point is, it's a dream. Create the dreams, the great bodacious ideas, push the bar out 10 years, think of the great realm of the possible. And then once you've done that, you come back and you create a vision, a written statement of what it is that you really want your life to look like in the future. It needs to be pushed out far enough that you're not limited by short-term possibilities. You have to push the bar out. I think 10 years. Now, if in my stage, I'm 72 right now, I'm still pushing the bar out 10 years, But I start to think more and more of 5 years rather than 10 years. I think it depends a little bit on your age. If you're much older than me, then maybe you ought to be thinking maybe not quite so much 10 years. But the whole point is you want to have broad visions. You want to imagine what's possible. And then you create a vision statement that is more realistic. Yeah, I want to be a quarterback for the Detroit Lions. Well, that's great. You're not going to get there in 10 years. On the other hand, the real issue here is competitive contact sport. Well, maybe you could go play old boys rugby. You can keep doing that until you're 80, as long as your knees hold out. Or maybe it's about hiking and riding bikes rather than contact sports. It still scratches the itches, but you do it in different ways in a realistic vision statement. I sent you a copy of a sample vision statement that you should have received. That is, again, it's kind of a made-up vision statement, but almost everything in there was on somebody's vision at some point. One of my clients. So it's all real. That's the thing. You develop the vision, and then you come back and start aiming for that. Now, the trick of uncovering the assets is really a problem. This is one of the hard parts here. But it is mechanical, given a little bit of time. And it's not something you do in one sitting. This is something that needs to be stretched out over several sittings, probably over several weeks. One of the things is you could just sit down with a blank sheet of paper and start thinking about, what are the skills that I have? What are the personal attributes that I have? What kind of interests do I have? What are things that are valuable to me? So and you just do that with a blank sheet of paper, or mind mapping, or some other kind of brainstorming method. The other option would be to use assessments. Now, assessments are pretty good for some of these things, but they don't work for all of it. For example, there aren't any assessments out there that are going to help you think about skills and knowledges. They'll help you think about traits, personal traits, values, maybe interests, but they won't help you think about skills and knowledges. Nonetheless, things like the Myers-Briggs or Clifton Strength Finder, those can help you think about some of this stuff. The most valuable thing to do, however, is to go back in your life, think about different phases of your life, your work life, your home life, your personal life, what you were doing when you were 15 years old, what you were doing when you were 25 years old. Look at the whole range of your life, all different aspects of your life, and then think about specific things that you did in each of those phases. It's like, when I was 15, I did this. I thought that was really great. I really enjoyed it. Okay, that's one of your stories. You put that down. Then you go back and look at that story. You say, well, why did I enjoy that? What is there about that was so rewarding? What skills, knowledges, traits, interests, and values are revealed in that story? And which of those are most important to me? The idea is you might sit down and do 20, 30, 40 of these stories from all different facets of your life. And what I think you will find when you get done with this is you're going to find a number of things that are consistent themes that run through your life. I mentioned history, travel, and teaching for me. A good percentage of the stories that I would put down would involve history or travel or teaching. It's absolutely a part of my life. But until you do this kind of stuff, you don't think about those things so clearly. And then, of course, you're going to start to uncover more things. When I did this, honestly, the first time I went through this exercise, quite a long time ago, it's here that I started to realize that actually standing up in front of people was something that I got a lot of pleasure out of. But I had never thought about that before. It was only as a consequence of going through these stories and seeing this kind of get up on stage sort of thing that has been a steady theme in my life since I've been a kid. I just never thought about it that way. So what are the assets? Prioritize them, and then you can move forward. Talked about All right, so again, you figure out what these assets are, and then what you need to do is essentially remove the blinders and start thinking about what could I do that would allow me to scratch those itches. Maybe being the tour guide in Normandy would be a really good thing for me to go after. I should do that. And so you can start pursuing it. You do have to dream. It's important to be talking to other people. You've got to get out there and read books about how people have lived their lives. You've got to look at your neighbors, at other people. I mean, my wife and I are continually kind of looking at people when we go anywhere, and we're always attentive to, gee, that person's doing something interesting. They may or may not be somebody who's in the next phase of life, but as I see what other people do, it helps trigger ideas in my own mind. It's not that you're going to replicate what they do. It's simply that, you know, you may never want to be a tour guide in Normandy, but maybe that concept triggers some ideas in your own mind that you might want to pursue. Another thing I think that's good is to look for role models. There's lots of people out there that have lived very successful lives where they've taken control of the direction that they're heading. And then there's other people that have done terrible jobs of it. Both of them are role models. Look for those role models out there. What did people do well? Where did they mess up? But this whole idea of dreaming and imagining the possibility is really important. There are a lot of books out there on this subject. And frankly, Marianne, I should have sent you a bibliography as well. I'll do that afterwards. The thing is that most of the retirement books talk about money and health. Not that those things are unimportant, but they really don't get into the activity bit. So most of the retirement books don't do this, at least not in any serious way. There are, however, a number of those books out there. I'll send Marianne a copy of a bibliography that I have, and then she can distribute it to all of you. I don't think there's one single perfect book out there. I certainly haven't seen it. But there's a lot of books that have some good ideas. And mostly what I'm looking for you to do is to get to the point where you can develop ideas of what other people have done. You can do some Googling of this as well, by the way. Now, one of the things that is a starting point here, after you've done some of this preliminary work of figuring out what those assets are, and you want to start putting all of this together, a kind of a shortcut way of doing this, especially to get started, is to think in terms of a bucket list. It isn't a vision. A bucket list isn't a vision. It's a to-do list. These are things I want to do. But it does move you in the direction of starting to think about what it is that you want your life to look like. One of the worksheets that I sent out to you includes questions that would also work for developing a vision statement. Let me just kind of get off this slide here and show you a sample bucket list. Where are places you'd like to see, places you'd like to visit, things you would like to do? I want to go to the Taj Mahal. I'd like to visit the Lake District in England. I would like to drive across the United States and stay completely off of freeways. I would like to learn how to speak Spanish. I would like to own an Austin Healey 3000. That's mine. That's absolutely mine. I'll never get it. It's never going to happen. Nonetheless, it's on the bucket list. The point is, this is not a vision statement, but much of life is about doing these things. Just in the past week, I've been at my bucket list. Of course, I don't have to look at it very often because I know it pretty well. But the point is that, what's on here? Learn how to fly a plane. That was off of my bucket list. I gave that one up. The goal I had was to fly a small plane across the United States. It's not going to happen. I'm not going to get a pilot's license. I'm not going to own a plane. It's too expensive, too much time, and it freaks my wife out. But I was at the airport yesterday talking to the manager at the Troy airport and talking to him about putting up a flyer to find somebody who would like to take a passenger in a small plane to fly across the country. I've got the letter written right now that I'll get posted up there maybe this afternoon, maybe tomorrow. And I'll start getting out there trying to do that. I'm not going to accomplish this, but I'll accomplish something that's going to scratch most of the itches related to that. All right, let's get back to this. Oops. So the bucket list winds up being a very useful tool to get starting to think about this. In the end, what you want to do is to create a very comprehensive vision statement describing all aspects of your life and what you would like your life to look like, not today, not next year, not in 5 years, but 10 years out. It is really important to push the bar out far enough that you aren't going to be limited by short-term possibilities. This should be written. Don't try to do this in your head. Written stuff works a whole lot better. You have to write it down. And as you do this, think in terms of what some of you in the business universe would be very familiar with, SMART goals. That is, you set specific goals. They're called SMART goals. They are specific, they are measurable, they are actionable, they are realistic, and they are time-bound. An example of this is that, years ago, I've always had an interest in art and drawing, and I have absolutely no talent, none at all. But over the course of my life, I've decided that mostly drawing is a mechanical skill, and that I could master the mechanical skill, even if none of my drawings or any of my work ever becomes anybody else likes it, I can master the mechanical skills. So one of the things of my vision statement that I developed more than 20 years ago was, when I retire, I want to learn how to draw. So that's kind of a very general sort of statement. I want to be able to draw. Well, technically, I could draw 20 years ago. I could draw stickmen, and I could draw fighter airplanes shooting one another, which is what I did when I was 9. But I hadn't advanced much beyond that. So as I moved into the next phase of life, being able to draw became important to me. So I developed a SMART goal. How would I know whether or not I could actually draw? Those stickmen and those fighter airplanes that I drew when I was 9, that doesn't constitute drawing. So I defined for myself that I would be able to draw well enough so that when I'm sitting in the cafes in Pamplona, Spain, in the afternoons, I will be able to draw postcards that I will be able to sell for the tourists in exchange for them buying me beer. That is quite literally the goal I had for myself. In 10 years, I'm going to be able to draw well enough so that I can sell my postcards in the square in Pamplona in exchange for beer. Get my beer money that way. But that's 10 years out. Now, what are you going to do next? What's the first step you're going to take in moving that direction? And so it was start taking a drawing class. And quite literally, that's exactly what I wrote out. I want to be able to draw. The proof that I'm able to draw is I'm going to be able to sell my postcards in Pamplona. And I'm going to start by taking a drawing class next month. And so I did. Again, nothing's ever going to be displayed in the Louvre, but I draw a lot now. And even my wife says, "Oh, gee, that's a tree, isn't it?" Yeah, it's a tree. Sometimes she can't get it right, but most of the time she does. The point is these SMART goals, the long-term goals, and then what's really important is coming back and thinking about short-term goals that you can use to get the process started. If I hadn't started by taking those drawing lessons, if Xenia doesn't start by getting that piano lesson, none of this stuff will happen. You need that first step. It's drop dead critical. So you convert the long-term goals into immediate actionable items that get you moving down the path. The next thing I just want to mention about these vision statements is that for most of us, if you're married or you have a significant other, I think there's kind of 3 visions that you're thinking about. The first is yours. The second is hers or his. And then the third is the two of you. It's a yours, mine, and ours thing. And my suggestion is, while you obviously want to be talking about this sort of thing, I would do the vision statements and the bucket list kind of stuff separately before you sit down and try and put the pieces together. I get very concerned that if you spend too much time with your spouse doing this, you will start to make compromises too soon. In the end, you're going to need to make compromises, but get your vision down first, and then let your spouse get their vision down. Together, you can come together and work out the rough spots. But don't expect them to be the same. I don't think there's any reason why they should be the same. There's yours, mine, and ours. One of the things that's helpful in doing this, I don't want to spend much time on this, but there's kind of what we define as 7 domains of life. And it's easier, it becomes a little bit easier to think about a vision if you can kind of chunk it into these various categories. These categories are fuzzy and they certainly overlap, and you don't need to worry about whether something belongs in personal or family. I'm not worried about that. Nonetheless, it does help you think about things. First of all, you have this foundation stuff. Where are you living? What kind of income do you have? How are you generating that revenue? Who's living with you? Very basic, what's your living condition like? Then you get to the personal stuff that may include the recreation, it may include your learning objectives, it may be just personal maintenance, you know, showers and eating and that sort of thing. Maintaining your health, all of that stuff that's kind of you, just personal to you. Then you have the family stuff. It's your spouse, it's the kids, it's brothers and sisters, it's parents, you know, it could be extended family, it depends. Then you get to the box or the domain that I think is especially important and different about the way I define retirement, and that is committed activity. It's that obligation you have to something outside of you. When you're worried about going out and play golf, the only one who cares about that is golf. But if you have 4 dogs, that's a committed activity. You have to take care of the dogs. They're not you, it's the dogs you have to take care of. If you volunteer at you know, at Gleaner's Food Bank, you have a commitment that you have to meet. If you continue to work either part-time or on a kind of a consulting basis, you have clients, you have responsibilities. Those committed activities, which in the old days was work, okay, in the productive phase, that was work. In the next phase of life, it isn't as all-consuming in most cases. It's going to be much less pressure. And then you have the social bit, which is the interaction with people outside of the family, friends, colleagues, associates, acquaintances, neighbors, whatever you want to call it. It's the interaction with people outside of the family. One of the things that's interesting about this is that for many of us, our social engagement was with people at work. And then when you stop working, you don't have that social interaction. As you move into the next phase of life, you got to think about that. We are social animals. How much social interaction people need varies, but I think all of us need at least some, and for many of us, lots of social interaction is critical. Stop working and you took one very important point of social interaction. Relocate to, you know, the mountains of North Carolina. It's beautiful, but who do you know? Where are you going to get that social interaction? And then you get to the idea of community. It's involvement in your community. It may be your town. It may be a club you belong to. You know, it might be the Knights of Columbus. There's all kinds of communities out there. So involvement in your community, whatever that happens to be, and that is also one of the things where the idea of giving back to the community starts to play a very important role. And then finally, there's the question of spirituality, which may be very personal, or it may kind of fall in the lines of your involvement in your, you know, established church. So these domains wind up being like different buckets that you can use to help you think about how this is all going to play out. And then in the end, you have to do something. I want a vision, I want a bucket list, but in the end, if all this is pieces of paper, it doesn't do you any good. You got to do something. And so the implementation thing is quite important. And we kind of talked about how I would suggest you do that. You have, for example, a general objective, gee, when I retire, I want to travel. That's great. You can't travel. You can't. What you have to do is to go particular places. So where do you want to go? You know, people who tell me when they retire that I want to travel, my first response to that is where? And, you know, at least 50% of the time, they don't have any idea. So where do you want to travel? You know, over the course of the next 5 years, we want to cruise the Greek Isles. Okay, if that's what you want to do, then a first step might be go to a travel agent and start getting an idea of what it would take, what it would cost, where you could visit. Now that's just the first step. But if you take the first step, the second step becomes a lot easier, right? So essentially it's this: implement the vision, implement the bucket list. You start typically with the general stuff. The bucket list usually gets very specific, or should be getting very specific. And then the real hard part is now, what's the first step you're going to take? Xenia, you want to be the piano man banging out tunes? You need to take piano lessons. And then you get to, once you get into this, once you actually do move over into the next phase of life, how do you maintain it? Let me grab something here. This, quite honestly, is something that I worried about as I moved to the next phase of life myself. And one of the things that I did is I have 2 books that I use. The first book is something I've had for a long time. It is kind of my brainstorming book for my vision statement, for bucket list. I have a written vision statement that's online. I revise that periodically. Although honestly, my first vision statement was written 20 years ago. I don't need to change it very much anymore. But it is ripe for me personally to go back in and start to relook at this. What I do, however, is I have this book and I'm continually jotting notes in there about things that are related to the next phase of life. The second thing I do is I keep a log. Every month, at the end of the month, I'll sit down and kind of jot down the things I did in that previous month that were essentially related to the bucket list, the vision statement. I don't talk about all the stuff I've done. It's not a diary. It's simply a log of the things that I have done that are consistent with my vision statement and the bucket list. I had a client call me a few years ago. And she'd retired for about a year, and she was very concerned about this, because what had happened is she had done the visioning kind of stuff. She had the bucket list, but it was a question of trying to stay focused. And, you know, she found this sort of approach very helpful in, you know, staying focused and not letting this stuff fall by the wayside. You don't want to get to the point where you're 80 years old and you look back and you say, I should have. I think you want to do as much of that stuff as you can. You want your life to look the way you want it to look like. And no regrets when you're 80. So there we go. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.